Hey there, in this video we are going to look at what a quadratic is and also how do we solve them. So what are the methods that we'll learn in this unit? So first of all, a quick review of a quadratic. So a quadratic, remember, means that it has a degree of 2. That's the key thing here with quadratic. So it's a degree 2. Now, the word quadratic actually comes from quad, which means square. And that's because the variable x gets squared in a quadratic expression or whatever variable is being used, but typically it is an x. So x squared is going to be the highest exponent. 2 is going to be the highest exponent on a variable in a quadratic equation. So again, that is a second degree equation because it is an exponent of 2 as the highest exponent on any variable. Now, the standard form of a quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a, b, and c are numbers, and a cannot be 0. So let's talk about some examples of quadratic equations. So I'm going to write a couple here. X squared plus 5x plus 4 equals 0 is one example. We may have something like x squared minus 9 equals 0. We could even have something that's not in standard form. So maybe 3 times x plus 5 squared minus 2 equals 25. If I were to simplify this to make it into a standard form, it would still be quadratic because we have that squared there. That's the highest exponent. That would be on an x when we go to put it in standard form. So in this unit, we'll talk about 4 ways to solve quadratic equations. So the first 2 are going to be factoring. They'll be under the realm of factoring. The first method is factor by grouping. And then we also have factor by guess and check. And under guess and check, we have when a is 1, when a is not 1, and when we have a difference of perfect squares. So we can actually use the same method on all of those. But if you know different patterns within when a is 1, a is not 1, or when we have a difference of perfect squares, then we can find shortcuts that make it a little bit quicker. But technically, guess and check is one method that will work in general. And then aside from factoring, we have square root method, and then we also have quadratic formula. Okay, so quadratic formula will work with anything that we can write in standard form. That's a quadratic. Square root method works with specific types of problems. And then factor by grouping and factor by guess and check. Those will work with our trinomials or if you break a trinomial up into 4 terms, then we can work with grouping that way. So we'll talk more about that in specifics here in a little bit, but I wanted to show you the 3 examples I gave you on the first page. The first one I gave you, this x squared plus 5x plus 4 equals 0. That could be factored by grouping, factored by guess and check, or we could use the quadratic formula on that. We cannot use square root formula or square root method on that one. Now, this middle one I give you here that was not in standard form, that's in what we call vertex form. That one can be solved by square root method. It can be solved by the other 3 if I first wrote it in standard form. So if I wrote out x plus 5 squared, simplified that, and rewrote everything, got it all on one side, you could solve it that way, but square root method is the more common way to solve that one because of how it's written. And then x squared minus 9 can actually be solved a couple different ways. So it can be solved by guess and check, it can be solved by square root method, and it can be solved by quadratic formula. And so we'll talk a little bit more and we'll see these different examples and similar examples to them and how we solve them with different methods depending on the problem. So as a quick review, a quadratic, remember, is when we have a degree of 2. So the highest exponent on any of the variables when it's written in standard form is a 2. Now, remember, we also talked about 4 ways of solving quadratics. There's factor by grouping, factor by guess and check, square root method, and quadratic formula. And we will talk about those 4 methods in depth over the next few videos.